So this is Buddhism in a Nutshell class, and it's the second of 4. So we will have 4 of these, and this is the second one. And just roughly what we did last week is we talked about Buddhism in general, what it is, who Buddhists are, how does it work, what are some of the common misconceptions and so forth. And then we actually finally started to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty. We actually went through in details the life of Buddha and the 4 messengers and so forth. And where we stopped, as it worked out for the timing, is Buddha's death, or when he achieved what's sometimes called parinirvana, where his physical body died, but his mental continuum, being fully enlightened, went to, essentially, he was liberated from samsara, as we say. And we'll talk more about that today, actually, I think, what that means, because that's a little bit complicated and it's probably not what you think. But anyway, I'll go into more details about that. So where we are now, so Buddha has died. But before we go into that, let me just mention one thing. Last week, we talked a little bit about the guru. And I was saying that, especially for beginning students, I don't think it's that big a deal to have a guru. And there's so few teachers in the West that it's hard for every student to have a personal guru that you can go and talk to so much. They don't have enough time. But the other thing I did say, I think, is that, if you really need a guru, it will somehow appear. And I just wanted to clarify that, because that's not based on magical thinking or anything like that. But the reason why I always say that, and believe it very much so, is because in the Buddhist world, it's a world of cause and effect. And we'll see that as we continue on with the main message of Buddhism today. So in Buddhism, nothing happens for no reason. There are always causes and conditions for everything that happens. And what my feeling of it is that if you genuinely need a guru, you will be creating the causes and conditions for a guru to appear. So that doesn't mean that just wishing for a guru to appear will make a guru appear, because sometimes what we wish for is not what's best for us. And that doesn't necessarily, just the wish itself doesn't necessarily create the causes and conditions for something to happen. But nonetheless, I sort of feel like if on a very deep spiritual level, you really need it and you're really yearning for that, you need help, I believe that you will, in some sense, create the causes and conditions for that to happen. So anyway, that's just again, sort of bringing out the way Buddhists think, which is a little bit different than perhaps the ordinary person thinks. And of course, this is all tied up in karma and so forth, which I will talk about today also. So anyway, so at this point, Buddha has died. So what happens? What happens to Buddhism when Buddha died? And as I said, the Buddha refused to appoint a Pope of Buddhism. He said, basically, I've taught you Dharma. I've taught you what you need to know. Let that be your guide. And he refused to create this sort of authoritarian structure. Nonetheless, there were still, at this point, there were thousands of monks who were Buddhists who had been following the Buddha, and they had to be taken care of. And so what happened, what was natural to happen, is the elder monks became their guides, basically. And since these people came from many different parts of that sort of northern India, Nepal part of the world, they sort of wandered off into different areas. And as they wandered off, each of them might have probably had some elder teacher who they could use to help guide the younger students. And they naturally relied on these elder students. And so Buddhism sort of fragmented, if you like. And in fact, it divided up into 18 sub-schools. Some of them think as many as 30. A lot of it just due to geography. However, again, I've been trying to contrast how the Buddhist worldview is different than the Western Christian view that we all grew up with. In Christianity, things schism or divide up because of different people have different beliefs. They believe, I don't know, some people believe in the Trinity, others don't, or whatever it is. They all, it's always belief-based. But for the monks, what really mattered was actually how they lived, the rules by which they lived as monks. And as is always the case, and in every group of humans, you always find strict people and relaxed people. And a lot of the schisms happened over the rules. Some of the monks thought, we should be really more strict. We got to do everything exactly as the rules were laid down. And other people said, just getting the spirit of the things is good enough. And, we don't have to be so strict. And also the physical separation, when people would live in different areas and communication wasn't that easy, they would naturally just sort of follow what their, the most spiritual monk who was with them, who became their natural leader, felt was the right way to go. So things sort of divided up, but it was more over practices rather than belief. And then, but quite quickly, they all got together because they realized that they needed to codify the teachings that Buddha gave. So within a short time, they all came together for the first council of Buddhism. And at that council, they codified all the teachings of the Buddha. And at this time, it was all an oral tradition, which was normal in India at that time. Most of the Vedas were passed down in an oral tradition. Pretty much all the Hindu works were all passed down in a oral tradition. And people were very good at memorizing. And essentially, they had a recitation of all the basic texts. And in Buddhism, there's actually, they talk about these as pitakas, or baskets. And there's basically three major baskets of Buddhist works, or three important ones. There's actually additional ones in the tradition, but the three main ones are the Sutras, which are basically the recordings of the teachings of Buddha. So when Buddha, from the age of basically 35 to 80, when he was giving teachings, all of the various monks remembered the teachings he would give. He would go to this city and he would give a teaching to these people. And some of the monks remember exactly what it was he taught. And so it was stored in their memory. And then he'd go to someplace else and he'd give some other teachings. And so all of these got collected and sort of put together, and that's what the sutras are. And of course, these people had amazing memories. So, it was probably pretty much word for word. And the other thing that the Buddha always did when he taught is he would also say, I'm going to tell you 3 things about this. And then he lists those 3 things. So that also made it easier to remember a lot of these things. And Ananda, the follower, who was basically his chief attendant toward the end of his life, was especially known for his memory. And a lot of the monks relied on Ananda to do this. And then once this was recited, then they had specialized groups of monks who would keep reciting this and remembering it exactly word for word. And it got passed down through the centuries until a few hundred years later, people started writing things down, and they wrote down all of these sutras and collected them. And that's that. And these sutras are a main body of teachings. The second Pitaka was the Vinaya. And the Vinaya is the rules for the monks of how to live. And it's quite interesting how the Vinaya sprang up, because essentially, especially when Buddhism started to become more and more popular, and you started to get hundreds and then even thousands of monks following Buddha, and they were all living together, it's always stressful in any community how do you live together in harmony? And so whenever there was a problem, they would come to Buddha, and Buddha would say, okay, I can see this problem. Here's a rule that will help you solve this problem so you don't have disharmony in the future. And so that became a Vinaya rule. And this continued on and on. Whenever they had problems, they added to this collection of Vinaya rules. And then this became the second Pitaka collection. They memorized and remembered all of these things. But it's interesting, when they wrote them down, they just didn't write down the rule. They didn't say, okay, the monks have to do this. They also gave the original story how that rule came about. So if you were a monk and you wondered, why do I have to follow this random rule? You could actually look it up in the Vinaya text and actually see the original circumstances for why it was necessary to create that rule. It is sort of amusing because just before the Buddha died, he told Ananda, we have all these Vinaya rules. If the monks want to, after I'm gone, they can actually get rid of the minor rules because they're not that important. And then later on, of course, he died. And so when they came to this council, Ananda told them this, and they asked Ananda, "Oh, did you ask Buddha, what are these minor rules that we can eliminate?" And Buddha said, "Oh, oops, I forgot to ask Buddha which ones were the minor rules." And so since they were unsure which were minor and which were major, they actually didn't eliminate any rules. But they were actually somewhat upset with Ananda for not asking. So anyway, but that's the Vinaya. That's the second thing. But there's a lot of teachings in the Vinaya also, because it also relates a lot of stories. And Buddha explaining these rules actually indirectly teaches a lot of the Dharma. A lot of the Dharma is what we mean by the Buddhist teachings. And then the third collection, the Pitaka, is known as basically Buddhist philosophy. And this is what the monks quickly realized, even while Buddha was alive, is that when Buddha would go to different places, Buddha would, through his inspiration, he had clairvoyance. He knew exactly what was in the minds of all the people he was teaching. He would sense that, and he would teach whatever he thought they most needed to hear, what would be most helpful to them. And so when he went to different places, he met with different types of people, and he gave different teachings. And so his teachings are all sort of scattered all over the place, and many of these different things. And that's not good in a pedagogical sense. So if you're a young monk and you're really, inspired by Buddha, you want to be a monk, you want to follow the Buddhist teachings, trying to go through all these sutras to learn the teaching is just, it's overwhelming. So what the older monks started doing is organizing all of this material in a way that would be easier to teach the younger monks. And in the beginning, they picked up on this thing when Buddha would say, "There's 3 things I need to tell you about this." They would sort of collect all of these collections of 3 things of this, 10 of that, 15 of that. And these were called maturkas, or they were basically just lists of items. And that became the basis for Buddhist philosophy. And then, of course, later on, they expanded on that and tried to explain, the meaning of all of the terminology and so forth. And from that, you basically got Buddhist philosophy, which is basically the Dharma organized in a systematic way and taught so it's easier to sort of go through it systematically. And then eventually through the centuries, of course, Buddhist philosophy expanded enormously and became very complex as you went. We have Buddha lived roughly 500 BC, so we have basically 2,500 years of Buddhism. But most of the main Buddhist philosophy probably was established, I don't know, by 1,000. Probably by 1,000 AD or something like that. But anyway, there are still teachers who are still elaborating on all of these teachings even today, because for each generation we have to explain it in a way that meets, wherever you live, according to your culture and so forth, to explain things in a way that you can understand. And that was something that Buddha really emphasized. At the time when he was alive, Sanskrit was the scholarly language, but he had never taught in Sanskrit. He certainly knew Sanskrit because he was a very educated prince, but he always taught in the local languages. And he told his monks, wherever you go, always teach in the local languages, because the important thing is not to put on this aura of religion or sacredness or sacred language or whatever, but to actually for people to understand so that they can do the practice. And Buddha was always extremely practical. He was never into appearances or form. He was always into whatever works. And so that's how, So that's the basic teachings that were started. And so these were formalized at this first council. And then, of course, as Buddhism spread, these things were carried around. And so in India, sort of, Buddhism was actually very popular in the north, and it spread out to more to the southern parts of India also as well. And a lot of the fortunes of Buddhism in India were pretty much like it is in most countries. India had all of these millions of little kingdoms, and they had monarchies, kings, and they also had republics and all different forms of things. And it was almost like, the way it was in, maybe Germany in the medieval ages, or Italy, city-states, or little areas bigger than that, depending on what people could conquer. So it's just a lot of scattered different governments. And the fortunes of, and sometimes these monks, the people who were monarchs or who ran the thing, liked Buddhism. So then their country became Buddhist. Other times they liked Hinduism or something else, and it became that. So it was very much, I think actually, in the Reformation period, when you had all these different Protestant sects and Catholicism fighting each other, it was sort of like that also. Whatever the local ruler wanted is sort of the way the country went. And but there were many places where the rulers really liked Buddhism, and so it spread quite heavily. And in fact, sort of at its height, there was a really famous king in India that ruled over wide parts of India by the name of Ashoka, and he favored Buddhism. And so at that time, there were large parts of India that were Buddhist because of the support of Ashoka. And there also were generated large, actually, universities. There were large Buddhist universities. Probably the most famous one was Nalanda. But there were several others as well. And this is where a lot of the Buddhist philosophy was developed. And eventually they all switched to Sanskrit because there was a lot of fighting with the Hindus. The Hindus wanted to basically suppress Buddhism. And there were all these debates trying to force people to convert. And these debates were very scholarly and were handled in Sanskrit. So Buddhism sort of switched, Buddhist philosophy sort of switched to Sanskrit. And a lot of the most famous, deepest works of Buddhist philosophy were actually started to be composed in Sanskrit then. And okay, so that's Buddhism. And Buddhism went on for quite a long time in India, but actually, quite interestingly enough, it was basically stamped out in India. And so it disappeared around basically the last abbot of a major Buddhist university declared that Buddhism had been destroyed in India and fled to Tibet in 1203 AD. So at that point, basically, Buddhism was wiped out. And there's people who say, well, we don't really know why or whatever, but there is a lot of data to suggest that it was a combination of two things. One, Islam was invading India from the north, and in fact, the Muslims destroyed many of the great Buddhist monasteries, and actually killed all the monks, burned all the manuscripts, and basically wiped out wherever they could, saying these are infidels. Of course, Buddhism was in the north. So as they swept south, they were wiping out a lot of Buddhism. The other thing, too, is that the Hindus never liked the fact that Buddha said that the caste system was basically nonsense, especially the Brahmins, who sat on top of the heap in the caste system. And so the Brahmins really wanted to get rid of Buddhism because they didn't like the Buddhists running around saying that, the caste system is ridiculous. There's no reason to have a caste system. So anyway, between all of these things, irrespective of what happened, basically Buddhism was wiped out. However, by that time, and of course that was a terrible disaster, because when they destroyed these great universities, they destroyed a huge number of Buddhist texts, both the original texts and also all the Buddhist philosophy that had been developed since then. But fortunately, by that time, Buddhism had spread beyond India. The only other thing, too, is I will just mention two other dates, and we will talk about this more, is that in terms of history, the original Buddhism as Buddha taught later became known as Hinayana Buddhism. And there was an emergence around just around the time of the birth of Christ of Mahayana Buddhism, which is actually the dominant Buddhism today. And of course, it was the Mahayanists who said that the original form of Buddhism was Hinayana, Maha meaning great and Hina meaning lesser. So the Mahayana said, oh, we've got this new form of Buddhism that actually is a lot better than the original thing. And so the Hinayanists always felt maligned. In the modern world, about the only Hinayanists left, but it is a major, large number of people, are known today as the Theravadan Buddhists. And they're in Sri Lanka, Thailand, and sort of that part of Asia. And it's actually quite a large community. And they still continue sort of the original form of Buddhism. But as I'm going to explain now, eventually most of the other Buddhism actually became Mahayana, which is what the Tibetan form of Buddhism is. But I will give more explanation of that as we go along. The other thing that I will talk about in the last class is Tantric or Vajrayana Buddhism, which is, if you like, a form of Mahayana Buddhism. It only exists in Mahayana Buddhism. And that began to appear in India around 700 AD. And so that appeared quite late also. So anyway, some of this stuff I will come back to, but I just want to I'm just sort of giving the big outline. So that's sort of Buddhism in India. So where did Buddhism spread and when did it spread? So probably the earliest spread of Buddhism happened around the 3rd century BC during the reign of Ashoka, where Buddhism spread way to the south of India to these large islands off the south of India, which is Sri Lanka and down in that area. And that's where the modern Theravada Buddhism sort of became originally centered. And so there was a whole collection of texts. There's an importance of this. All the original texts of the 3 Pitakas in a complete form were transmitted down to Sri Lanka. Earlier, it used to be called Ceylon, but now it's called Sri Lanka. And so we have a complete set of the original Buddhist texts, which have been preserved in a language called Pali, which is a simplified Sanskrit, if you like. And they think that this Pali was related to what the dialects that were actually spoken around where Buddha actually lived and worked, although there's controversy about that. But anyway, this Pali is sort of a dialect form. And now the only form that it exists in, as it is in these Pali texts, is these Buddhist texts is the only, nobody actually speaks it as a primary language anymore, if they ever did. So anyway, but that is one collection of texts, and it's important because it's in an Indic language. It's in a language that's probably very similar to what the Buddha spoke. So it's probably the form that is closest to the words that Buddha actually used. So having it in an Indic language is hugely important. So that's one place where the original Buddhist texts survived. The other thing that happened is beginning around, again, a little bit before the time of Christ, in the 1st century BC, it started to spread to China. And in China, eventually China, all of the Buddhist texts were translated into Chinese. And actually a lot of the Buddhist philosophy from India, the later philosophical works were also translated into Chinese. And so so that's where our great second collection of Buddhist texts are. They're actually preserved in the Chinese language. And roughly the ones that correspond to the early days, which is what the Theravadins took with them down to Sri Lanka, they basically are very almost identical. There's very small variations. And so it gives you sort of more confidence that the original texts were preserved correctly. And eventually, of course, China is enormous. And again, Buddhism spread, and wherever it spread, it sort of developed variations. And ultimately, there were at least 10 major schools in China, one of which was the Chan or Zen version, which was later to spread. So from China, it also, the other place that Buddhism spread, it spread from there to Korea, especially the Zen version, and also to Japan, which has a huge amount of Zen versions of Buddhism, but they also have other schools of Buddhism in Japan as well. And even in the Zen tradition, there's not just one school of Zen, there's actually at least 3 different schools of Zen in Japan, which is probably different than the Korean version of Zen. So it's typical. Again, there was no authoritarian structure to Buddhism by design of the Buddha. So everywhere you went, there are all these different variations of Buddhism. And these variations differ mainly in some of the details of practice, whether they emphasize religious ceremonies or not religious ceremonies, how heavily they emphasize meditation and so forth. And of course, Buddhism adapted to the local culture. So it took a form that took on the colorations of the local culture. And so it became different in that respect also. And of course, in addition, Buddhism also spread, being in northern India, it of course spread to Nepal, and then eventually into Tibet. And it went into Tibet around 770 AD. And the first time it went into Tibet, it was very prominent, but then one of the kings of Tibet didn't like Buddhism, basically stamped it out. It became very corrupt and sort of disappeared. And then around 1000 AD, Atisha, a very famous teacher, spiritual person from India, was invited to Tibet to sort of reinvigorate Buddhism, which he did. And he actually ended up dying in Tibet, but he actually sort of brought this renaissance of Buddhism back to Tibet. And then from that time forward, Buddhism was firmly established in Tibet, although some of the forms of Buddhism in Tibet incorporated some of the earlier Tibetan religion, which was the Bon religion. So there are some aspects. Again, it was just, Buddhism took on the local coloration of wherever it went. And the Tibetans love religious ceremony. So the Tibetan form of Buddhism has tons of religious ceremony in it, unlike the original form of Buddhism or the Theravadan form of Buddhism. And later on, of course, as Buddhism evolved in Tibet, it actually over time developed 4 major lineages, is what we call them. So sort of slightly different variations. From a distance, I think for most of us, we look at all of Tibetan Buddhism as essentially identical. But among them, they actually have these sort of 4 different lineages that developed over time. The earliest one was the Nyingma, which was the original form that came to Tibet in this time of, around 700 AD, 770 AD, was brought by Padmasambhava, and that was the original form of Buddhism in Tibet. Later on, there were some great spiritual leaders, Marpa and Milarepa, who around 1000 AD developed a form of Buddhism that was heavily emphasized meditation. And that's what the Kagyu tradition is called today. And this is what if you hear the Karmapa is the leader of this lineage. And then around that time, about 1073 AD, the Sakya lineage was formed, which was a very intellectual form of Buddhism. So they were the people who really preserved a lot of Buddhist philosophy, and they had great Buddhist philosophers who were Sakya leaders. And so they heavily emphasized teaching and philosophy. And then finally, the last one, which is the one that our center belongs to, is the Gelugpa, which is actually, and today, and has been since that time, has been the largest in terms of number of people in Tibet. That's the largest division of Buddhism. And that was started by Lama Tsongkhapa, who lived from around 1357 to 1419 AD. So around 1400 AD. And he was also a reformer. There was a lot of corruption, sometimes monks marrying and other crazy stuff. And he was sort of a reformer. And he sort of reformed Buddhism. He sort of came out of the Sakya tradition. And so he also emphasized intellectual teaching. He was very much a teaching order. And so to this day, the Gelugpas, they become very heavily, and so basically it's the Gelugpas and Sakyas where most of the great Buddhist philosophers in Tibet came from, which isn't to say that the Nyingma and Kagyu don't have, some very great intellectual thinkers also. And they all four traditions have their traditions of how to teach Buddhism. But again, from a distance, from us, they all look very much the same. But among the Tibetans, they see them as very different. And again, a lot of it is just sort of this emphasis on more meditation, more teachings. And also, they had people like Marpa and Milarepa would teach specifically based on their own spiritual experiences, and they would pass along what they felt was helpful. And so there's slight variations in religious practices, some religious ceremonies, and some of the different tantric practices differ between some of the different lineages. However, the other great importance of this was that the Buddhist texts were all translated into Tibetan. So Tibet was the other place where we have these complete set of Buddhist texts that were translated, from the very early days. And there were especially certain Sakyas and other people who really emphasized translation. And they would invite, famous philosophers from India to come up to Tibet and help them with the translations. And they actually developed very accurate ways of translating from Sanskrit into Tibetan. They were very detailed, and they had special terminology, and so they were very, very careful. And so that was our other source of surviving Buddhist texts. And they also translated the more recent things, and not only the original things, but they also translated the great Buddhist philosophy texts that were done in 400, 600 AD, 1000 AD. Those were a large number of those were also translated into Tibetan, not all of them. So those are our three sources of ancient Tibetan texts from India were preserved, either the original ones in Sri Lanka with the Theravadins, or the more complete sets of later philosophers, including a lot of the Mahayana teachings in Tibet and China. And so the original form of Buddhism was this Theravadan, but after the Mahayana appeared, like I say, basically around or maybe a little bit before the birth of Christ, roughly, the Mahayana really took on. And there's one famous Buddhist scholar who's dead now, who was sort of an early scholar, Edward Conze, who basically believed that the Mahayana just it was easier to adapt to the local cultures, and it just seemed to make people happy. And so that sort of became the dominant thing that was transmitted to China and Tibet and Korea, Japan, all these other places. And so that became, so today, in today's world, the Mahayana is by far the dominant form of Buddhism, although there's a strong Theravadan showing in Southeast Asia, and which of course came to the United States and spread around the world, England and other places. But anyway, the only other things I will just mention as a way of just terminology, in Tibet, the Buddhist canon was divided into two pieces. One was called the Kangyur, which are basically essentially the sutras, the original teachings. And the Tangyur is the second grouping, which were all of the commentaries written in India, you know, in 400, 600 AD and so forth, from the great Buddhist philosophers. And so even today, and the Tibetans kept their things. They had these sort of long strips of paper that were maybe 12 inches long, maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches wide. And they actually wrote on both sides of these things in paper, collected them up and wrapped them up. And that's how they transmitted their texts instead of books. And so if you go to a Tibetan center, you will often see a whole collection of this Kangyur and Tangyur sort of in, I don't know, set in maybe in shelves on a wall or something inside the thing. So, and they're often done, printed very nicely and wrapped up very carefully in all of these, wrapped, you know, very, you know, taken very good care of or something. And in our new center that we're creating here in Santa Fe, they're going to again have this complete collection on display. Okay, so that's basically, and of course after that, when especially in the modern world, because the British were in India and they also were in Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka now, and all these parts of the world, they brought a lot of Buddhism to England and to Europe. But even earlier than that, there was a lot of transmission of Buddhism to Europe, all throughout 1800s and so forth. And of course, when Tibet was overrun by the Chinese and essentially a lot of the Tibetans fled to India, then a lot of them also spread all over the world. So there's a lot of Tibetan Buddhism all over the world because of that. So there's a lot of, now in the modern world, there's a lot of Buddhism in America, in Australia, England, all over Europe, all of Russia, all over the world, in fact. So that's basically the short version of Buddhist history. So let me just stop here and ask whether there's any questions about this. Again, it's a little bit overwhelming, but it's just to give you a quick overview of roughly what happened.
I actually found it quite helpful. I know bits and pieces, and I recognize the names that you made. So it puts a lot of things in context for me. So that was really helpful. I'm assuming the Dalai Lama would be in the Gelug tradition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's the
so
Gelug.
Obviously Mahayana. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly. That's exactly. And in fact, the interesting thing that most people don't know is that the Dalai Lama is not the head of the Gelugpa tradition. The Gelugpa tradition has always had its own head. It's actually a rotating position that every few years they appoint a new person. And the Dalai Lama has never been the head of the Gelugpa tradition, even though he's always been formally part of it. And however, from the Tibetan point of view, especially since after they were overrun by China, and they're now sort of spread all over the world, the Dalai Lama is sort of their spiritual father. And all four traditions sort of revere the Dalai Lama and look to him for spiritual advice. And for his part, the Dalai Lama tries to be even-handed among all four of these Tibetan lineages, because he just realizes, you know, people are very stressed out. They don't have their own country anymore. They're living all over the place. They're trying to maintain their spiritual and cultural traditions. And so he supports all Tibetans of all lineages. And so he makes a very careful effort to be even-handed among all four lineages, even though formally he is part of the Gelugpa, and has always been since the Dalai Lama position was first created. He has always been a Gelugpa. Okay.
Okay.
So anyway, that's.
Yeah, what you have given, yeah, is this written down anywhere, sort of a synopsis of the history of Buddhism? I'm just curious, because
yeah, you can find it in different places. I mean, I just picked it up over many years of studying it all over the place, and so I don't remember, you know, learning it from a single source.
No. Okay.
But it is, I mean, I'm sure you can find books on Buddhism
Yep.
that will explain this sort of,
Okay.
but anyway, and yeah, so I don't know a good single source for the whole history,
Okay.
but it's probably, you can probably find it many places.
All right. I'll have a peek. Thank you.
Okay. So now what we're going to turn, so now we've done sort of the beginning parts, the history, the background. So now we're going to plunge for the rest of our classes into the nitty-gritty of the teachings of Buddha. And again, like I say, in the Asian form, you don't have to believe any of this that I'm going to teach. But anyway, I will just give the teachings. Because Buddha always said, he said, don't believe what I say. Buddhism is experiential. You're meant to go out and practice these things and see whether it works. And then if it works, then you start to gain confidence in what Buddha said. And eventually, if you gain enough confidence, you basically pretty much accept almost everything that Buddha explained.
Okay. So I've got a question here.
Sure.
As a Westerner, and this is a problem I've had. Like, I've been, told, I've heard things, okay, this is what the Buddha said, you think about it for yourself. And then I turned around and said, yeah, but I don't get that, it's possible to, well, first of all, reincarnation, I don't get.
Yes.
Like to. I know the theory and blah, blah, but in my heart of hearts, I kind of go, not so sure about this. And certainly I acknowledge Western civilization has not, been coming at that concept really easily. Then the other aspect of it is that we could reincarnate as animals and that animals have Buddha nature. I find that a big stretch as well.
Good.
So those are the two Western, and I would say I'm probably pretty typical in this.
Yes.
And so if you could approach those on some level, that would be helpful.
Okay, I'll say a few words now, and I will come back and give more details later. But basically, you don't have to believe any, again, to be a Buddhist, you don't have to believe any of this. In fact, there's a very famous Buddhist, God, I forget his name now, it's escaping me, that writes Buddhist books where he says that he doesn't believe in reincarnation. So it's actually, you don't need to believe in reincarnation to be a Buddhist. Like I say, you don't have to believe in anything. I mean, you can do the meditation practices, you can take any form of Buddhism that you want to practice and just practice it. And you don't, Buddhism is not about believing anything. So nonetheless, however, the Buddha did teach reincarnation. And of course, it's tied up in karma. It's the only way for karma to really make sense. Because, you can, one way of looking at it, in fact, is through karma. You can ask, okay, people are born all over the world. Why is one person born into a really wealthy family, has all the advantages, has a happy life, lives this various thing, and another person is born into a slum and maybe dies very young of some horrible disease or, is in horrible circumstances and suffers horribly. And so you ask, how can I understand that? And what Buddha basically said, the answer is karma. We are born, we are reincarnated on the basis of karma. And so when karma comes to fruition, then that has a cause on where we're reborn, even within the human realm. And so that's one way of looking at it. However, you have to understand that you yourself are not reborn. And in fact, Buddha doesn't believe that there's any such thing as a self or an Atman or a soul. So what in Buddhism, what's taught is that we are just a process, if you like. A mental continuum is often the word that's used. And so the way to think about this is, look at yourself now at whatever age you are, and then look at yourself when you were 3 years old. Are you the same person or aren't you? And if you look at that in a very objective way, you can say, well, in a certain sense, I'm not the same person. The way I think now, I've had all of these experiences. They've changed how I think, how I feel. and when I was just a child, I didn't have any of these experiences. My thinking, my emotions were very primitive and so forth. And you can just see that you really weren't the same person. You're not the same person at all. And it's like that. With the other big theme in Buddhism is change. Everything in our world is constantly changing, and that also applies to us. Our bodies are constantly changing, but also our mind and mental, our emotions. And Buddhism mind also includes emotions. It's just not rational thinking. So all of everything that we would consider part of our mental makeup, or what the ancients would consider to be a soul, our emotional, our thoughts, our feelings, all of that would be is constantly changing. And so there's nothing permanent inside each of us. There's no permanent soul or nothing permanent of any type in our world. And so we are just like a stream of consciousness. In the same way that we talk about a river, we identify a river, we give it a name, but the water that's flowing through the river is different water. It's constantly changing. It's new water that's flowing through. And it may be picking up soil, not picking up soil, have different colors and so forth. And that's the way that a human being is considered to be, is that it is just this continuing mental process. And in the same way that our mental process changes and evolves all throughout our lifetime, so that moment by moment, in a sense, we're different people, in the sense that we have different thoughts, we have different emotions, we have different bodies. In the same way, that mental continuum continues on to the next life. However, in the next life, we can be reborn as a human or in other forms, which I'll come and talk to. But the only difference when you're reborn is that there's this forgetting. When we die and are reborn, we forget all about our previous lives. And so the next life we live in is colored by all the experiences we have in the next life. So who your parents are, whether you're born in a wealthy, impoverished, wonderful, terrible environment and so forth. And just as, if you were to ask somebody today, who are you? What most people would do would give you a little biography of all their experiences of their life. And so in your next life, you'll have a different set of parents, different set of experiences. So in your next life, you'll explain who you are based on the experiences of that life. What Buddha really said is that really the only thing that really is transmitted from life to life is our karma. And it's our karma that actually goes that is reborn, if you like. So anyway, that's just a short way that you can think of rebirth. It's not like, it's like, and there are people who can remember previous rebirths. And the Buddha said that when you reach a sufficiently high level of spiritual development, you will actually remember all of your previous rebirths. And in fact, the Buddha could remember all of his previous rebirths. And he actually often gave these as teachings, because he would explain simple moral teachings based on his previous lives. And he would give stories of his previous lives, and this time I was a king, at this time he would even give, these are called Jataka tales. And he even gave examples from when he was an animal and so forth, experiences he had as an animal and so forth. So anyway, it's not important to believe, but it's very, as we will see, it makes a lot of sense if you think about karma. So I don't know if that's a little bit helpful now, but that's just the start. I will talk more about this. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. So again, and all of these things, I would say, if it bothers you, just don't worry about it, because it's not important. Actually, the most important thing is just to be a good person. And because, again, the goal of Buddhism is to be happy. And if you are a good person, you don't have to worry about future rebirths. It will make you happy in this life. And again, various forms of meditation is very, very helpful, and they will make you happy in the moment now. And in fact, the Buddha often talked about that the very highest forms, when you develop really deep concentrations, which requires a lot of work to develop that kind of technique, he talked about how blissful that is. And that's the highest form of bliss that you can have on earth, far, far higher than any sensual experience of pleasure. The spiritual bliss is, and in fact, you can experience that from yourself. You know, if you practice meditation and you get the deeper levels, you will get the sense of the pleasure you get starts to become very subtle, very refined, very high level, and just amazing. And in fact, one of the founders of our centers, we have Lama Zopa, but there was Lama Yeshe, who's dead now. He was a great meditator. You know, he used to emphasize that. He said, people only could experience this. They wouldn't care about sensual pleasure at all. They would just go off and meditate all the time. And in fact, there are people who become addicted to meditation because these forms of bliss are so absolutely amazing. So anyway, let me continue on now, because a lot of these things I will need to come back to. And in fact, Buddhism is like that. It's sort of layered. You know, a lot of the ideas that you first run across are so strange that it's like your mind just rejects it. You say, oh, this is ridiculous. You know, it's so different from the way I thought before. So it takes time to sort of let these things percolate in your mind. And it's good to take that time. In fact, it's important not to jump too quickly and say, oh, well, Buddha said this, so it must be true. It's good to actually complain and say, oh, this sounds ridiculous. Because, the only thing that matters is being genuine. So you have to be genuine, and actually, if things strike you as wrong or ridiculous, you have to say so, and you have to stick to your guns if you like. However, at the same time, what the Buddhists always say, and the great teachers always say, it's good to just be open. Just be open to, maybe there could be reincarnation. It doesn't make any sense today, but maybe in the future I will have other experiences, and maybe those other experiences will lead me to actually finally change my mind and believe in reincarnation. And I think that's what basically happened for me. So my background is I'm a theoretical physicist, so I'm very rational and very traditional. And so for me, a lot of these Buddhist beliefs were actually foreign, and I rejected them. And over time, I have come to believe in reincarnation and so forth. But it's actually okay. It's like, again, everybody's looking for this magic pill or this magic bullet. It's like, oh, if only I get this, then my whole spiritual life will make sense. I'll be saved. Everything is perfect. It's not like that. A form of spiritual life is a continuum. It's a gradual change. And Buddha himself taught this. He gave the example of, it's like, taking a very sandy shore on the ocean and gradually walking in deeper and deeper. And you have to base, in Buddhism, it's so important to base things on your own experiences. So you have to listen to the teachings many times, think about them, ask yourself whether they make sense or not make sense, but only accept those things that make sense. And you have to look at your own experiences in life, your experiences in meditation, and you have to make up your mind based on those. Anything else is not genuine, and in fact, it's quite frankly not helpful. So I would say, just relax. Don't get all hung up that, oh, I need to know this. If I don't, I'll be, condemned, or terrible things will happen to me. No, nothing will happen to you for not believing in anything. Really, you have to take things little by little. And really, I think it's so important to be just absolutely honest with yourself and only accept those teachings that feel right to you and jive with your experience and make sense to you. So, okay, so I'll get off my little sandbox here and stop that. Get back to the basic teachings. Okay, with that said, what is the core teaching of Buddhism that everybody accepted? And even the Mahayana, everybody, even today, all forms of Buddhism, they're based on the Buddhist teachings, because basically from what Buddha taught, Buddha himself said, okay, this is the core. This is the essential thing. If you're going to become enlightened, it's these teachings that are going to, again, create the causes and conditions for you to become enlightened. And so what is this basic teaching? And the core of it are called the Four Noble Truths. And actually within the Four Noble Truths, you can actually fit all Buddhist teachings, even Mahayana Buddhist teachings in. So it is probably the broadest framework for all of Buddhism. And these Four Noble Truths were explicitly taught by Buddha when he was alive, and he emphasized it very strongly. So what are the Four Noble Truths? Well, first of all, let me just say what they are, and then I will give a detailed explanation. And so basically, again, from the biography that I talked about, the thing that Buddha emphasized was his goal was to enable humans to remove all suffering and to be permanently happy. So the first noble truth is the truth of true suffering. The fact that our current world, the experiences we have, is a world of suffering. And again, I'm going to go into more detail about this. And the second thing, again, everything in Buddhism is cause and effect. Buddhism says this isn't accidental, but there is actually a cause for why we suffer. And the cause for why we suffer was actually again, I'll talk about it. These are sometimes called afflictions, delusions, klesha in Sanskrit. And these are things like ignorance, greed, and hatred are sort of the primary ones, delusions. So I will again explain this more. And the Buddha said, is it's possible to put an end to your suffering by basically, and so this is called true cessation. So we've had true suffering, true cause. This is true cessation. So it's possible to end all of this suffering. And essentially it's by eliminating all of these afflictions, delusions, kleshas. And this puts an end to what we call samsara, our world of cyclic existence, where we're reborn over and over again into a world of suffering, which is our present world. Everything you experience is samsara. And when you do that, when you put an end to it, you essentially leave samsara and enter nirvana, or what's sometimes called enlightenment. Okay, and again, I'm going to explain this more. And then the fourth noble truth is, again, this doesn't occur just by miracle or accident. This occurs by following what is the fourth noble truth called true path. So true path are basically the Buddhist teachings. And what the Buddhist teachings are is the techniques, the methods that you do use to create the causes to end being stuck in samsara. And ultimately, this way of achieving the true path, the deepest part of that is by acquiring wisdom about the world, seeing the world the way it really is. And when you see the world the way it really is, then that enables you to put an end to all of the things that cause you to remain in suffering, grasping, clinging to this sensuous world. So anyway, that's in a nutshell what the four noble truths are. And again, now I'm going to go through in great detail what each of these are. But let me just ask, again, if there's a general question at the beginning, because so again, these things sound very odd to a Westerner. But again, you can see the emphasis on suffering, and you can see it's just a completely different way of looking at the world. And it's completely different from any other form of religion. So again, I think it's important to realize how Buddhism is sort of a unique thing, and that's a completely different way of looking at it. Because this is these four things are the core truth. And all the other teachings of Buddhism can be fit into these four things, even karma and everything else, which I will explain, reincarnation and so forth. So is there any questions at this point, or?
No, the hesitation you hear is just the concept of karma in terms of people are born in different kinds of ways. Just my tendency is to think it's the luck of the draw. It doesn't necessarily mean that this implies that something has happened previously that caused,
Okay.
I just don't quite make that connection, but
Okay,
that's where
that's
I'm up
good.
to.
That's good. Hang on
That's
to that because we're going to go deeper into this. Okay.
great. Thank you.
Okay, so that's good. Yeah, it's good. It's good, and in fact, as I studied Buddhism, I also did this. There were things that I didn't understand when I first heard it, and I just hung on to these questions sometimes my answers only came like 10 years later or something like that. But whenever there was anything I didn't understand, I just kept it very clear in my mind. This doesn't make sense. I don't understand this, and I just hang on to that in the back of my mind. And then, interestingly enough, often many years later, like even 10 years later, there would be some teaching and they would explain it, and then finally I would get it. But I think it's very helpful to hang on to these things because Buddhism, from a Western perspective, is very weird. It's a very different way of looking at the world, and it takes time to get your arms around it because it's the same way with any new thing. When you first hear any new thing, it just sort of immediately goes over your head. Even though the words it used seem very strange. And so the first thing in learning a new area is just getting familiar with it, learning the terminology, how they talk about it, what's said, and just getting some familiarity with it. And then after you get familiar with it for a while, then you can actually begin to study it and actually relate it to your experiences. But again, it's very important in all of this to relate everything to your own experiences. But anyway, so good. So that's good. Hang on to those reservations. And we will see if we can do a little better job. Although, of course, in just a short introduction to Buddhism, you can't expect everything to be answered. Like I say, many of my questions took many years to answer. But anyway, I will do the best I can. But let me just go a little bit deeper. So you begin to get, as I keep talking about this a little bit deeper, you'll begin to see sort of this whole system and how it all sort of fits together. And the beauty of Buddhism is actually that all of the Buddhist teachings ultimately all do fit together. They're a coherent body of teachings. And over time, in fact, learning this area of Buddhism often helps you understand a different area of Buddhism because they're all interconnected and they all interrelate to each other. And it's through those interrelations that over time, things begin to make a lot more sense. But it's like everything, it's like you often have to look at things 12 different ways before it finally hits you. This is what they're talking about. And so I'm going to try to use a lot of different ways of talking about things. And maybe one of those ways will make more sense than another and be helpful. So let's start with the beginning. So we got the Four Noble Truths. So that's the central truth is just the truth of suffering, true suffering. And there is also a medical analogy that's often used in these Four Noble Truths. And the medical analogy is you should think about this as someone having a disease. So the disease or the illness is true suffering. So that's the problem we've got, suffering. There's a reason for the suffering. And so the doctor, and the doctor is Buddha, diagnoses. He looks at the causes because in real life, if you've got polio or you got cancer or whatever, there's always diseases aren't random. We may struggle to understand them, but ultimately there's a real reason why we have diseases. And if you want to cure your disease, you have to figure out what's causing the disease. Is it a bacteria? Is it a virus? Is there some medicine that'll attack those or whatever? And so that's the same way of these Four Noble Truths. So suffering is our illness. Buddha looked at what causes suffering. And he says, oh yeah, it's these kleshas. And then he said, well, can I cure this disease? And he says, yes, I can cure it. And I know you can cure it because I myself have become enlightened. And whatever I did to become enlightened, if you do the same thing, you're going to become enlightened also. There's no magical thinking. Things happen for a reason. And if you create the causes and condition for something to happen, there's no choice. It has to happen. It's almost like science. Like, the law of gravity. If you're in a gravitational field, you're going to feel that gravitational field, and you're going to feel that force. And there's no choice in it. It's just the way the world works. And so karma and all these other things, these are just laws. These are just natural laws of the universe. And the only difference is that a lot of the things that Buddhists taught have to do with our mind. The mind is central in Buddhism. So karma and a lot of these things have to do with our mind. And as physical beings, mind is different than material. So karma and these things are, so our mind is different from our table or a chair, which are made of matter, atoms, and so forth. And mental thing is a completely separate thing. But what Buddha said is that our minds have laws whereby they operate in the same way as material bodies have laws of physics or science. So anyway, so Buddha said there's true cessations. And why does he know that there's a true cessation? Well, he said it's obvious. If you know the cause, and if you can eliminate the cause for your suffering, then you won't suffer anymore. And Buddha said, I know the cause of suffering. I know how to eliminate it, which is the fourth noble path, which is the true path. And so the true path is like in the medical analogy, it's the treatment. So, you have this disease, maybe it's caused by a bacteria. You take some medicine that wipes out the bacteria, and then you're cured of your disease. And it's the same way in Buddhism. And so the treatment is the true path. So in fact, what Buddha often said, he said, I'm not, I can't save you. I can't give you a blessing and cause you to become enlightened or achieve nirvana. You have to do that because the problem is all within your own mind, and only you can solve the problem in your own mind to remove the negativities of your mind that prevent you from becoming enlightened. But what the Buddha always said, he said, my role is to point out the path, to tell you how you can process this, how you can get through this, how you can create the causes and conditions to become enlightened, so that if you follow this true path, you will become enlightened. And of course, the true path is, they often say, I don't know where they get these numbers from, but that Buddha gave 84,000 teachings. So this path is a broad one. There's lots of different things that you have to do to become enlightened. And you do some of them simultaneously. Sometimes you complete some stuff before others. But there's a lot, again, it's a broad continuum of things, practices that you have to do. There's not one single thing that saves you, that causes you to become enlightened, but a lot of things that reinforce each other, that help you to go through this process of purification. And in fact, in the Theravada school, they call one of their main textbooks for how to practice the main Buddhist path, the path of purification. It's through purifying your mind, getting rid of these negative delusions, afflictions, kleshas, that enables you ultimately to purify your mind. And at the deepest level, this involves a type of wisdom or removing the ignorance that you have about the world, which is what enables these delusions and afflictions to happily live in our minds. But anyway, we will gradually go deeper and deeper into this to explain it. Okay, so that's the medical analogy. So here's the starting point. So the starting point is the truth of suffering. What is the truth of suffering? Suffering, as I explained before, is really more broader than suffering. It's actually most people translate it as dissatisfaction. It means that there's no way of living in our world that is completely satisfying, that we can say, okay, I'm there, I'm completely happy, I just got to keep living like this for the rest of my life, and that's it. I've achieved complete happiness. What we discover is that every part of our experience in our human life has some aspect of where it's not completely fully satisfactory. We always want more and more and more, and we can never reach an endpoint where we've got enough. And in particular, what Buddha said is, he said that there's three main types of suffering. So again, we have these numerations, three things. So the first type of suffering is the obvious suffering, which is called manifest suffering. And or sometimes I call the suffering of suffering, that's ordinary pain. It can be mental pain, It can be physical pain. You can have a physical disease. You can hit your finger with a hammer and feel real physical pain. But you can also have mental anxiety or anguish. So it also includes mental suffering as well. So that's the suffering of suffering. The second one becomes more interesting and goes a little bit deeper. And this is called the suffering of change. We suffer because things change. You know, humans hate for things to change. We always want things to stay the same. You know, there's even people who are often in bad situations and bad jobs and bad relationships. A lot of times they resist moving away from those bad situations because they sort of feel like, well, maybe if I change, it'll be even worse. So it's better to stay with this bad situation rather than to try to change. And it's also like that. Here's another way you can see the dissatisfaction of change is imagine that you're eating this most delicious meal that you've ever had. The problem with it is that that happiness of that meal only lasts a moment. And then after you finish the meal, it's a memory. It's a dim memory. It's not as vivid. It's not as joyful, as wonderful as the pleasure you had eating the meal. And it's a form of suffering that you can't hang on to this bliss of this meal. You know, it would be wonderful if we could eat some food and just say, okay, that's it. I never need to eat again. This was so blissful and it's so vivid that I just, it's great. But it's never like that. We're always unhappy. Another example is maybe a kid at Christmas. You know, the kids are so excited, Santa's going to come. There's all these Christmas presents. They're looking forward to it. And then they get this present that they've been looking forward to for maybe several months. And then they play with it for 2 seconds and cast it aside. They're bored with it. And it's like that with everything. We get bored with everything. You know, if we experience anything too much, we always get bored with it. And then it's no longer satisfying. And then we're looking for something else to stimulate us. You know, it's like people go to great extremes to get stimulation, pleasure. You know, they do sky jumping, they do all sorts of crazy bungee jumping, all sorts of crazy things. You know, it's like we're just never satisfied. We always want more and more, better food, more movies, better experiences, faster cars. You know, billionaires who have everything they could want, they always want more. They want more billions. And that's this dissatisfaction. There's always dissatisfaction. And it's always a dissatisfaction that we can't hold on to our bliss. That bliss just, we might have it for a moment, but then it's gone. And that's painful. It's always painful. You know, in my mind, it's far worse to have enormous wealth and then lose it all and be thrown into poverty than never to have had that wealth. You know, you look at the people in 1929 when the stock market crashed, people were committing suicide, throwing themselves out of high windows because, they had been so rich and they had this wonderful life and they couldn't imagine living anymore if they were going to be poor. And it's like that. And so it's always like that. The world will always change, no matter how much wealth or whatever good things you have. In the next moment, it will always change. You'll never be able to hang on to it. Nothing good. You can never hang on to anything for more than a moment. Everything in this world is impermanent. So this notion of impermanence is so, so critical to Buddhism. And because of impermanence, our world will always be unsatisfactory. And then the final one is a deeper thing, which I can't really get into. It's called pervasive suffering. And there is a form of suffering. Buddha said, just because we're born means that we're going to have suffering in life. Because we're born, it means that we live in samsara. And if we live in samsara, samsara is by its very nature impermanent. Everything that's impermanent is unsatisfactory. So just by the fact that we're born in samsara, we will never have satisfaction or true permanent happiness, but our world will always be just unsatisfactory. And the other aspect of this is that there is this notion where they say that samsara, or the lives that we live, are contaminated. So what do they mean by that? It's a funny way of saying it. But what they mean is they're contaminated by these negativities in our mind, these delusions of greed, hatred, and delusion. And these contaminations through the karmic implications permeate our lives. And in fact, the only reason why we are born in samsara is because we create the karma to reborn in samsara. And so the way to achieve nirvana is to learn how to stop creating the causes to be reborn in samsara. And that's what the Buddhist path is at its very deepest levels. And of course, the other thing to understand is that in fact, our deepest suffering is actually mental. It's one thing, you can receive a physical form of suffering, a pain in your arm or your wrist or something. Some people react very strongly to this. They're very sensitive to any kind of physical pain, and they just go nuts with it, almost crazy. Other people, they just ignore it. It just hardly bothers them. And the reason why, the difference is what goes, all of our experiences are filtered through our mind. And it depends a lot on how our mind reacts to all of these experiences, how much pain or suffering that we experience. So ultimately in Buddhism, they say that a lot of times they say our world is created by mind. And what they mean by that is that all of our experiences are processed by our mind, and our minds have a lot to do with how pleasant or unpleasant we experience everything that happens to us. There's no thing that's an objective pain or whatever. Everything is processed by our mind and is actually influenced by the state of our mind. And that's part of the reason why you can actually achieve even a temporary sort of form of almost perfect happiness if you can learn to control your mind, if you can learn to control the reaction of your mind to the experiences you have, you can actually, dim out a lot of the pain that would naturally occur. Okay. And so the other thing too is that there's also these standard things that Buddha said are really good examples of our suffering. One of them is sickness, aging, and death. Sickness actually is physical pain. Aging, for us that are getting older, we experience our body aches, we can't do things. It's painful to lose our faculties, our physical and mental faculties, to watch our teeth fall out, our hair turn gray. It's aging is painful for most people. And of course, death, for most people, they feel it as very painful. However, as Buddhists, you train yourself so that for many Buddhists, their death is very blissful. It's not painful at all. But for the average person, there's a great fear of death. And then the other two standard things is, which I always found quite interesting, but the Buddha himself said this. He says the other two kinds of suffering we get, and sort of on a day-to-day basis, is there's always some suffering because we don't get what we want. We always want things and we're always thwarted. There's a lot of things we want, we just never get. And that's a form of suffering. It's a form of mental suffering. And the flip side of that is we often have to encounter things that we don't want to encounter. So maybe you have to go to the doctor's office and get some some medical procedure that's painful, or going to the dentist. I always hate going. There's all these things in life that were always unpleasant things. We can see ahead of time. Oh my God, I don't want to experience that, but I just have to. And that's the other form of sort of minute by minute suffering that we get. So these last two things I find are actually quite insightful. So that's the spiel on suffering, sort of in a nutshell. Let me just ask if there's any questions on that. Okay.
No, I just can't help but comment. I recently I was at a friend's house, and there were photographs taken of me, and I was amazed at how, from my perception, how bad I looked. Okay, and it's like that. When you talked about change and how hard it is, I kind of pride myself on being accepting, of change. But that was a confront, because I thought, my God, I look so old and haggard.
Yeah, no, it's like that, and it's
You know,
hard.
it was sort of like, hang on, I'm usually pretty cool about this, the whole process, and oh, this is happening, that's falling apart, that's interesting. But this was like a real confront. So yeah, that
Yeah.
rings quite true, quite
Yeah, I mean,
accurate.
it's interesting when you take these ideas and again you apply them to your whole life, and you experience it moment by moment. And think back, it really can be quite interesting that and in fact that this acceptance that you talked about is actually a major way of actually dealing with the sufferings of ordinary life. If instead of getting angry, getting upset about it, you can learn to accept, oh, this is part of samsara. This is the way the world really works. And if you can learn to accept, okay, this is the way it is, and I'm just going to let it happen. A lot of times that reduces a lot of the mental anguish of the suffering of whatever we're going through in the moment. And it's actually taught later on that this acceptance is a way to get rid of the karmic experience that you're having now.
Yep.
So if there is some karma which is causing this present experience, when you accept it, it's often taught, well, that's how you get rid of that karma forever. When you accept it, that's the end of it. You'll never experience that karma ever again. So and I actually
part of my acceptance is that I'm grateful for what I do have, and I try to put my mind into that direction. Yeah.
Yes.
It's like, and I think the Dalai Lama says this. You wake up. I'm grateful when I wake up, and I'm also, I think I'm way ahead of the game because I can get out of bed.
Okay. Yes. Exactly. That's part of it. That's part of it.
And then and feeling, relatively healthy. And celebrating that is also a very excellent technique for me to counter some of the fear and uneasiness about change.
Yes, that's excellent. That's actually, that's extremely good. However, I would add to that, in addition to that, which is really good. I mean, it's wonderful to be thankful for the wonderful things that we do experience. But in addition to that, even when you're feeling painful experiences, you can also go through this same acceptance. So when the experience, so you can rejoice for the good things in life, but you can also be okay with the bad things. And there's different ways of looking at this. I mean, I have a personal experience because I did this. I got, in 2007, I had gallstone pancreatitis. So a little stone fell out and blocked these important passageways. And I went through one of the most painful types of illnesses you can have. I was taking these things that were 80 times more powerful than morphine, and they still weren't even touching the pain. So I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. It's a thing that can kill you off. And for me, this was a Buddhist practice. And so for me, this very painful experience was a powerful way of giving me a chance to go through spiritual practice. And one of the main spiritual practices was this acceptance. And the way I viewed it is I'm having a lot of suffering, a lot of pain. However, I'm probably burning up some horrible karma that, it's bad the way it is, but perhaps if I weren't burning it up this way, perhaps it would come in a form that was far worse in the future. And by this acceptance, it actually calmed my mind, and it didn't bother me as much. There was also another Buddhist practice called taking and giving, which is a Mahayana practice that I also practice. And I'll explain that when we come to the Mahayana teachings. But these spiritual practices were very powerful. And in fact, there's some Buddhists who actually wish to get cancer or some terrible disease, because that's when your spiritual practice goes into overdrive. That gives you the chance to actually make huge amounts of positive spiritual progress, because it's easy to deal with happiness. It's difficult to deal with difficult things. So if you can deal with difficult things, that's often the huge push when you actually advance the fastest in a spiritual sense. So you can accept suffering in a spiritual sense as a way of progressing faster along the spiritual path. So anyway, I just throw these things out. It's just things to think about. but certainly rejoicing for good things is good. But still, there's even other things that you can do that are even maybe at some stage a little bit deeper. Okay, so we've hit 8:30. Again, it always takes more time to explain all these things, but it's okay because these early things I think are the most important. So I should stop here because I don't want to, drag on and make people think that these teachings are too long. So the next time I come back, I'm going to actually talk about the next phase, which is the cause of suffering. And this is where I will talk more about rebirth, karma, and other things. And then after that, I'll talk about the truth of cessation, which I'll talk more about rebirth and nirvana. And then finally, I'll talk again about the path and so forth. So maybe I'll stop here just so I don't drag on too long. But all these, it's good to get stopped and slowed down to answer all these questions, because this is where what people really need to hear. So I appreciate the questions and I don't mind going more slowly. So having said that, let me just ask, are there any final questions?
No. Well, the only final question I have is, should I talk less?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
I mean, okay. It's wonderful to ask these questions, because I think, that the deepest teaching on the Buddhist path is actually these questions, because the questions that you're asking are the things that people usually most want to hear about. Yeah. And if I just give my usual spiel, they may never have a chance to get talked about. And it's important to talk about the things that matter to people the most, because again, everything is based on our experiences. And what I found in this class is somehow I find a way to accelerate and get through it all, no matter how many questions are asked. So don't worry about it. It's my job to negotiate getting through all the material.
Okay.
And I will, and what I'll do if I need to, I'll just streamline where I need to. But a lot of these early things are the most basic points, and they are the thing that is important to take time and talk about. Because a lot of the esoteric things are useful to get some of the jargon and stuff, but for a person, studying Buddhism, even a very experienced person, a lot of times they get caught up in these deep special practices or something like that, and sort of gnawing in the background are these really fundamental, simple, basic questions, and they just don't get answered because they get so caught up in all the esoteric things and trying to get those right. And I think that you need the basics, you need the foundations. It's important to bring up all of these doubts and concerns, because otherwise the rest of the path doesn't work as well. So I'm very happy that you bring these things up, because I'm sure it even benefits a lot of the people who are listening in on the on the Zoom library, looking it up.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So don't worry about it. Keep asking everything. I appreciate that. Okay. And if more people out there who are listening to the Zoom want to drop in live and ask a lot of their basic questions, that would be even more wonderful. Yeah. So having questions is my favorite thing. So lovely. I thank you so much for asking questions. So I will see you next week, and we'll continue on for the last two classes.